Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Johnny Mnemonic from 1995. Oh, where do we go with this one? If you are familiar with this movie or with me and the things I like to talk about and look into, you may be familiar with Johnny Mnemonic as a movie that is generally not particularly well regarded. However, it does have its own cult following, as I understand it. And though I don't think I've ever met somebody who was a member of said cult following, it is a curiosity for me. It came up in conversation a little while back with a friend. We were talking about cyberpunk as a genre and some other media around that genre and what it has been doing in the past and recently. And I don't remember even why Johnny Mnemonic came up or how much we even discussed it, but it was just sort of sitting in the back of my mind because it's come up enough times in my life and it's not such a commitment that I didn't think I could just, watch it and see if it was actually as terrible as it's alleged to be. So I went for it. And you know what? It's not atrocious. And that's kind of the problem. Because this movie, in a way, needs to be worse. How do we get to that point? So this is a curious movie because it is based on a short story by William Gibson. And the screenplay itself is also written by William Gibson. The original short story, it's about 14 pages. I actually read it after I watched the film. I had not read it before. The original short story is very, very good, very tightly knit, and very quick, obviously, with it being as short as it is. And I highly recommend if you're into sci-fi stuff and haven't read it before, just go look it up. It's easy to find. So having the original writer, who, in fairness, the original script was written, or the original short story was written in 1981, quite a bit before this movie came out, is a curiosity for a whole bunch of reasons. Now, it is pretty well known that this movie was pretty well butchered in the production process. It has not been completely disavowed, but the screenwriter William Gibson and then the director Robert Longo, both of whom are kind of like artsy weirdos, both said that it was heavily messed with and they didn't get final cut and there will never be a final director's cut of the movie or anything like that. And I do always put stock in that when directors and writers say those sorts of things, but I just cannot fathom that this, even in the original director's cut, would have been a great film. An okay one, maybe, but not a great one. And there's a whole bunch of curiosity I have about what happened behind the scenes of this one. This is very heavily adapted from the original short story. Obviously, there's not a lot you can cram into a piece of media that short. So it was going to certainly have to be fleshed out. But it is only very, very loosely based on the idea. It's based on the very basic concepts and a few sort of characters and plot elements and beats. The rest of it is pretty heavily adapted. And that's not inherently a problem, but it does always make me curious, as I've talked about before, that when you transfer from one medium to another, what do you gain? What do you lose? Adaptations are always subject to, of course, interpretation, as well as adding and removing of content and adding and removing of both media ability and imagination. When you add you add audio visual to a story, you fundamentally reduce the viewer's ability to use their imagination to imagine certain things. You also take away the ability to do certain narrative elements and things that are natural in a piece of writing and a piece of prose, but you can't really transfer to screen. So you gain some, you lose some, of course. I would love to find out if there's anywhere an original script, the original screenplay as written, because I'm just so curious how heavily it was adapted. This movie has a lot of problems, and the writing is kind of number one. And I'm curious how much of that is the fault of the scope explosion. Apparently, allegedly, what happened was this was supposed to be about a $1.5 million movie. That's what they were asking for originally. And it was so artsy and niche that nobody wanted to pick it up. And it was cast and recast a couple of times. Wasn't even supposed to be Keanu Reeves in the lead role in the first place. And after Speed, which was he did shortly before this, another movie we've watched on the channel, he apparently Sony suddenly decided that they should fund this movie heavily. And then apparently there was a lot of writing muddling and casting muddling, etc., etc., etc. Now, I could certainly see if they added a bunch of characters so that they could cast certain people who are relatively large names and so on, that would heavily change what the rest of it looked like. But I wonder just how much of Gibson's original writing is in there, because stylistically, it sounds nothing like him. I am not the biggest William Gibson fan. I don't love his style of prose. It can be very jerky. I don't know how to explain it better in short. But it can be a little bit kind of very, very rough around the edges. And nothing about the writing or the characters or anything really in this really feel like him at all. Except for some of the like character designs and individual concepts, larger scale things that are his own invention. So I do wonder if this entire script is just almost completely rewritten. Because most of the dialogue is pretty poor. Now, some of it is worse than others, and it is definitely not helped by the fact that there are some bad performances in this film. Keanu Reeves especially, who I've expressed before, I don't think is a particularly good actor, at least in terms of his like line delivery. He's very limited in his abilities that I've ever seen. And this is him sort of in the height of his fame, very near his peak of fame. Probably it peaked about 2 years later for The Matrix, but also being probably not directed super well and probably not given a lot of additional acting training. The 80s and 90s were really full of a lot of subpar actors who were basically could have been made into better actors, but they were mostly there to look pretty. You know, the action hero style of character was rampant, and they just needed a face. And if it was a face you had seen before, that would sell. So anyway, I'm on a tangent about why Keanu Reeves was cast. Anyway, my point being that he delivers a pretty terrible performance throughout this film. And there was one moment that kind of threw me for a loop. Now, I actually just talked about, I think in the previous video, if I've done these in order, about how I quite like Nicolas Cage. And there is one monologue in this film, sort of near the end, that Keanu Reeves does that starts to feel Cage-esque. It's over the top, it's performative, it's like just kind of ridiculous and out of place in a way that feels almost like it finally synthesizes all the aspects of the movie correctly. And by correctly, I mean in a very strange way. But then I take a step back from it as I'm thinking this and go, no, it's just cheesy and bad. This writing is bad and his performance is very silly. But that gets into kind of the thing about this film is I wanted it to be sillier and cheesier and take itself less seriously. And allegedly, the original cut was a lot more ironic. I don't think they ever said it was cheesy necessarily, but that is what this movie needed to be. The first half especially, and probably first 3/4 in general, take themselves pretty deeply seriously. And there's a little bit of there's a good chunk of stuff that's kind of hard to tell whether it's being done with tongue in cheek or not, which is always a bad sign. Now, a lot of that can be changed with context and editing. So maybe with the original intent, this could have been edited into something that does hit different without a huge amount of production change. But it seems to take itself deeply seriously while having bad characters reading bad dialogue, and falling into action movie tropes left, right, and center. The rest of the cast, just while we're at it, there's a bunch of people in this film who are somewhat notable names. Dolph Lundgren, Takeshi Kitano, Ice-T, and then there's a couple of people who I also recognize from other things but couldn't necessarily place or don't know their names. But the casting is it's not without some name to it, but I guess that's the whole point, is probably that it was supposed to be the names, not that they were actually expecting great performances. But again, we don't know all of what happened behind the scenes and who cast whom and at what point. What else do I even talk about? I guess the last quarter, the last bit of the movie, the last arc of the movie, it almost hits its stride, but it doesn't. I thought it did. I had to think about it for a little bit as I was watching it and after I finished it, because it almost starts to redeem itself. It leans into the hacky, over the top ridiculousness. It's got some beats that I have to assume were shot for comedy. And it kind of starts to work. It kind of starts to be endearing in its cheesiness. It's the moment where I started to think, this has finally hit the so bad it's good sort of level of thing. But it's not really there. I almost want to say that it's fascinating enough to be worth watching, but it kind of isn't, because there's just so many other films, both sort of within the genre and adjacent to it, that do the stuff that it does better. Whether it's Blade Runner or Mad Max or Total Recall or RoboCop or like all of these big names that I can see either the things, in most cases, things this took influence from in terms of their dramatic presentation and their production influences, but they just do it worse and without self-awareness, or without apparent self-awareness at least. And it's just a kind of a rough ride all the way along. Especially after reading the... No, I don't want to get too much into having read the short story now. It's just, the short story is just so different. It's just fundamentally better because it's not trying to be an action movie, and this one is. And it's a bad action movie. The choreography is bad. The costumes are mostly mediocre. The the pacing is bad. The sets are rough. The dialogue, like I said, is just kind of terrible. The cinematography is at best boring, and at worst makes your eyes kind of spin in your head. I will say that there is a charm. I have seen this movie roasted repeatedly for its CGI. I actually think that the CGI is pretty charming, even now. Does it look good? No. It very much has that that element of that sort of shiny, that shininess to it, that very flat but trying to look more dimensional effect that was on a lot of 3D rendered stuff in the 90s and very early 2000s. But it is hilarious to see, even for the time and place, that this probably looked rough. But it's also not trying to be realistic in any way. It's not trying to be impressive with its CGI. It's very sort of aware of its own absurdity, the context in which it's used. It's not CGI for within the main movie. It's these scenes of full CGI, and they look dated, but I don't think they look bad. They articulate what they're supposed to visually articulate, and I almost think that remaking them conceptually is impossible, because the whole concept of their appearance and the inherent roughness of them is kind of the point of the scene and the way that you sort of interpret the whole technological operation of the world that you're observing. So for those who think that it's bad because of the CGI, there's lots of things to complain about with this film, but I don't think the CGI is particularly one of them. It's simply dated. Let's see. What else do I have to say about this? I mean, it's just disappointing because it could be another, Blade Runner type thing. William Gibson wrote Neuromancer, which is arguably one of the most influential and most genre-setting, genre definitive piece works for all of cyberpunk. And I believe Neuromancer came out after the short story, but significantly before this movie. Neuromancer is really, in some circles has been repeatedly requested as a, please make a movie out of this. This is a better production to make. It's a story for that's still classic for a reason, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just, I want to know why this film exists. Um, if by all accounts, it seems like Longo and Gibson really wanted to make this in a very small, artsy way. It was all blown out of proportion, and rather than, having any ability or willingness to push back and say, let's change the entire scope of this, they stretched it out into something else that was not good. I don't know. This movie's just fascinating, and its whole place in culture is fascinating too, because for all of the terrible things I have to say about it, I still can see little bits and pieces of this that probably seeped there, like are that look like influences in things that would come after. Even things like The Matrix definitely feels like it was probably heavily influenced by this film. And yet I don't think I can say this is worth watching. If you want to skim it, I think maybe that's a better use of your time. And while it doesn't, it's not a complete waste of time, it doesn't horribly drag. It's mostly just kind of boring and kind of poorly produced and kind of poorly acted. So if you're a bit like me, I don't regret watching this. If you're a bit like me and are just curious for the sake of sort of a cinematic history lesson, and also another sort of pinpoint to put in a greater understanding of a particular genre, a particular actor, or other sort of long-term cultural media cinematic influences, I think this is interesting for that reason, but it's not a good movie. That's just sort of the long and short of it. Anyway, I don't think I'll ramble on about it anymore. It's just curious. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.